Okay, so we've got our state and props set up, our React is working. It's time to actually bring in Web3 so that we can recognize Ethereum and our MetaMask, and that way we can connect that to our blockchain whenever we load our app. Because you got to remember that all of these components are just being loaded, and they're these life cycles that come up and they go up into React, onto JavaScript on the engine, and they work in a way that's supposed to work in this refreshing style, which which makes it much more efficient than let's say how we were working with JavaScript before when it came to websites and applications. Oh yeah, so when this automatically loads, when the page automatically loads, we want to be detecting essentially the MetaMask and the Ethereum, up over here. So in order to do that, when we were writing out our blockchain code with Truffle, we would use Web3, and it's the same thing in React. We're going to bring in Web3. So what we want to do is import Web3 from Web3, like that. Okay. And then we're going to create a function to load our Web3. So it's going to be an async function. So we want to say async Web3. Okay. And what do we want to do? Well, we want to create some conditional logic. We want to say that if window.ethereum, so if we find the window of Ethereum, okay, then window.web3, and we want to create a new Web3 window.ethereum. And then we need to await window.ethereum.enable. We're going to run the enable Ethereum, and we're going to enable it. We're going to call it like that. Okay, so this is basically saying here that if there is a window, so if in our window, this is our window. It's a global function. It's a global function here for window. So if in our window we detect Ethereum, MetaMask, then we want to create a new instance here of Web3. Then we want to essentially enable it. We want to enable our Ethereum from our window. So we're going to wait for that. So we're going to wait, and we're going to await for it to be enabled. Okay. And then we want to say else if window.ethereum, else if window.web3, then our window.web3 is going to be a new .web3.current provider. And if we can't find that, if we don't have Ethereum, or we don't have the current provider, then what we're going to do is, oh wait, hold on a second. Sorry, this needs to go. Else here we can say window.alert. And oops, we don't need this. Hold on a second. Components. Nope. Let's get that done. So there were some extra curly brackets I just cleaned up. And okay, wait. So before I finish the alert message, let me just run through. So we're saying if we find window.ethereum, then we want to enable. We're going to wait for window ethereum.enable. Or if we find Web3 in our window, then whatever the current provider is, we're going to go for a new Web3 with the current provider. Otherwise, if we don't find this, then we're going to create an alert, and we're going to say, we're going to tell whoever's connecting to the network, no Ethereum browser detected. Check out MetaMask, for example. Check out MetaMask, or you can check out MetaMask. So essentially, this function connects the app to the blockchain, and if you're not following along, it really literally it doesn't really matter. The important thing is that this is what MetaMask. These are the step-by-step instructions that MetaMask provides essentially, and you're going to see this whenever you want to hook it up to the blockchain and hook it up to our browser. And okay, so now that we have this function, we actually need to call it in order for it to work, but we're not going to call this function in the render, right? We don't want to call it here. But where exactly do we call this function? Well, we want to call our function within our class app. We want to load this before, we want to mount this before we're even rendering. Essentially before we're even rendering. And we can do this by using one of the life cycles that React has. And React has several life cycles. We're going to create async component will mount. And component will mount is called immediately before mounting occurs. And we're going to go await this.load web3. Oh, and I just realized a typo. This shouldn't be async web3. We want to call this load web3 because we're loading it. So let's fix that. And I just want to actually give a warning here. Component will mount is considered by React to be unsafe when it comes to async re-rendering. And it really, I mean, it's going to work and it's fine for what we're building, but because they consider it to be unsafe with async retriggering, what we can do is we can just call it unsafe component will mount instead of component will mount. They prefer that we use that as a best practice because using component will mount is not the best practice with React. We're going to be bad boys and bad girls and go ahead and use it. So let's save this now and see if this will actually load up MetaMask to the blockchain. So we're going to go back to our app and we're going to refresh. I'm going to scroll up and wait a minute. I just realized that it says the tag H is unrecognized in this browser. So I made a mistake when we rendered out our hello world. Maybe some of you caught this. For the header, this shouldn't just be an H. We have different types of headers. We can do 1, 2, 3. They changed the size. So I wanted to put H1 actually. So that's just a typo on my fault. So back for the hello world, it should have been H1, not H. And let me just save that and refresh. And we're just getting some regular warnings here. Or just see some regular warnings here. Okay, this is fine. Oh, and it says we don't need to use the word image. That makes sense. It's redundant. So I'm going to go to the nav bar. And in my alt where I added bank image, I'm just going to write bank. And that should get rid of that warning. Refresh. Okay, that's gone. That's gone. And if I check in our terminal, looks like everything is working and set up. Looks like everything is working here in this terminal, which is great. Looks like we're compiling successfully. We've got some warnings, but that's fine. So we're using, again, the component will mount, which essentially just is calling our load web3, and it calls it immediately before mounting and before we render. And we want to do this first before we do anything else because we want to make sure that our MetaMask loads. It's the #1 priority. Otherwise, nothing's going to work. That's why we add this into here. Now that we've added the web3 and we call the function, now that we've hooked up our web3 and hooked up our Ethereum and we call the function, let's go ahead and actually load the blockchain data as well. And we can do this by creating a function called load blockchain data. So I'm just going to add it right now, even though it doesn't exist yet. So we'll just do load blockchain data. And we're going to call this as well. And we can just create another async function in order to load our blockchain. So what we're going to do is we're going to say async load blockchain data. It's a function like this. And what we do is we can set a variable constant web3 equals window dot brain freeze web3, and then we can also make an account, constant account equals, and this is where we can actually get the account from our blockchain data, and let's see if it's all up and loading. So we can do web3.eth.get accounts like that. Okay, and we can actually console.log the account like that. So we could do console.log account. Okay, and so let's just save this and see if we can log the account. Okay, so I'm back here on our page here. I'm going to refresh. And looks like we got a promise that was pending. So for some reason it didn't actually run the async. Let's see why. Oh, can you spot the problem? what went wrong here? How come we didn't receive the promise? Well, we call the async pattern, but we're never waiting for anything, right? So not capitals like that. So we add the await like this, and let's go back and try again. And if you look here, we see an array, and there it is. That's the account number. And if we look at those last digits, 11E87A0, and go to Ganesh, 11E87A0, we have a match. We are successfully retrieving the blockchain data, and we are successfully loading in our Web3. So, okay, and so just to further demonstrate that we are essentially with this load Web3, we are bringing in the MetaMask and hooking up our Ethereum and MetaMask. If we were to remove the async load Web3 and we removed the load, right? Or we don't even have to remove the function. If we don't even call it and we save and we go back to our Firefox, what we're going to see in our errors here is that we get this MetaMask no longer injects Web3, and then it wants to send us to this document. And if we click on the document, it actually goes through the code that we just set up together to inject it. So there it is. If you want to read more about it, you go to the MetaMask docs, guide IO, guide provider, and you can go into the window Web3s. You can look at the APIs, and you can take a look at all this stuff. I always encourage you to go to the docs and check it out. But hopefully, if anything, this just shows you that the progression of events, and that in order to load the blockchain data successfully, we need to have the MetaMask up and operational. And when we have everything working together, and we go back, we go up, and we see that the account is loaded. Awesome. Okay, so this is a great point to stop for now. We have successfully injected MetaMask into our application with Web3. Go ahead, take a break, have a coffee, and in the next video, let's keep on keeping on. Okay, see you soon. All right. So in the following videos, I'm going to be working a bunch with Web3, okay? So Web3.js, essentially what it allows us to do, it's that it allows us to interact with our MetaMask or with our customers' MetaMasks on our front end and connect it to, on the front end, and connect it to our contracts, connect it to the network that we have on our Ethereum network, and allow transactions to run and function that way. Okay, so we actually leverage quite often in this course the Ethereum JavaScript, the Web3.js Ethereum JavaScript API. Okay, now you're going to see me coding out Web3 in order to access our mock tether and to load up our blockchain data and to run and attach it to our state. And that's fine if you're not sure what that means yet, because we're going to be looking at it. But the point isn't that. The point is that, just in case you're wondering, well, how is he coming up with all this stuff? Well, it's not out of thin air. First of all, we're reverse engineering from what Greg built out. And I really want to encourage you, as a guide on your journey through coding, to always go to the docs. Always go to the docs. I mean, that's how you're really going to learn, take it to the next level. You go to the docs, and that's the best way to find out exactly what to write out. So if we go to our API reference here and we look at web3.eth.contract, okay, we actually get to see different models and patterns of how we can actually get our contract. And we see we do that with web3eth.contract. And they say here, the object makes it easy to interact with smart contracts on the Ethereum blockchain. And that's what we want, right? On our front end, we want to be interacting with our smart contracts on the Ethereum blockchain. So when we create a new contract object, we give it in the JSON interface, right? And then from there, Web3 automatically converts our calls into these low-level API calls over RPC for us. So this is what's going to essentially be able for us to take those JSON files that we created and then convert them into these low-level API calls. And we see here that we have different ways to do that. So we can grab We can make a new object, so we can make a new contract by bringing in new Web3 ETH contract JSON interface, and then we can bring in an array with address and options. Okay, we see that, and then they go into letting us know about the parameters. So address string is optional, options of the object is optional, transactions, returns, and then they give us examples. So contract over here, so you're in the contract, you have an address from another address, we see gas price, default gas price, and there's an example right there. And there we have an example. So this provides us a blueprint for working with our Web3. So okay, so again, if you're looking at this and this looks very confusing, I'm going to be implementing these lines of code one by one together. So if you have any takeaway from this, it's just remember, go to the docs. Always go to the docs. The more you read the documentation, the better you're going to get at understanding how all these things come together. So now that our blockchain data is being recognized and the account is being recognized, it's time to bring in the next logical step. Here would be to actually bring in our smart contracts, bring in our smart contracts, bring in our decentral bank, right? Bring in our reward tokens, bring in our tether tokens, and bring this all into the state on React so that we can display all this information. Just like we did with the account, now we want to do this with the actual contracts. So how do we do that? That may sound pretty daunting, but actually it's not so bad, and we're going to see how to do it using the patterns which we're already starting to become familiar with. So the first thing we want to do is let's go back to our constructor where we set our state, and we created an object with just one state, right? And that was the account. And the reason why we put it in an object like this was so that we can add more state down the line. So we want to initialize state for all of our contracts, and then we want to initialize state for the balance of these contracts as well, because we're going to want to display the balance and the changing of the balances, right? When we're depositing, when we're withdrawing, and when we're issuing rewards and checking the balance. So how do we bring in the contracts? And you know what? I'll give you a hint. What we want to do is we're going to add something here. I'm going to put a comma here, because it's an object. We're going to have one thing at a time. And for a hint, I'm going to say, well, if I want to bring in the tether contract, what I would do is I would write tether like this, and I want to input something here. And so go ahead and give it a shot. See if you can figure out what tether should be initialized as. And once you figure out tether, try to do the other contracts and then try to create state for the balance of these contracts as well. So pause the video. I'm going to have a sip of coffee, and then when we're back, we'll continue forward. All right, welcome back. Hopefully you had some success. If you had no idea what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. We're going to go through it together. If you figured it out, that's amazing. Great work. But what we need to do essentially is for tether, the tether contract, since it's a contract, it's not just going to be an array, right? An array could give you a list of things, of items inside. We want to have more than just that. We want to have information that can go, we want to have more complex information that could go in. It's not going to be a string, and it's not going to be a Boolean either, right? With a true or false. So our contracts are objects, essentially. Remember, they're JSON. Remember, we have our contracts set up as JSON files, and JSON is essentially JavaScript object notation, right? So where's our JSON, by the way, here in our Truffle APIs? We have all our API information here. So this is what we want to be loading in and initializing to our state, so it makes sense to set it up like an object. So tether, we're going to bring in RWD. It's also going to be an object. And we're going to bring in the central bank, of course. That's going to be an object. And then I don't know what that was. Oh, that was supposed to be a comma. Okay, and then for the balances, well, we're going to want the tether balance. And that's going to be what exactly? Well, since they're balances, we're going to want to make them string. So we're going to say like for a number. So we're going to have the tether balance. We're going to have the reward balance. Also string, and then we're going to have the staking balance as well. which we're also going to set to 0. And we're initializing everything as 0. Here we're initializing all the contracts as empty because we're going to bring them in. We initialize the account as a number value, and then we have these as well. And then the final thing that I also want to bring in is loading. Because, when you have a website and you want it to look professional, you don't want to, it's very important to think about how things are visually loading. And if something's taking a long time to load and there's a blank screen, that doesn't look very good. So having a loading message is very important in that sense. Just like in the sense of when we're thinking about mounting things and the consecutive order of what we want to mount and unmount and refresh, etc. in our page, it's also important to think about with loading, all right, are we having a loading as well? So to do that, we're just going to set up loading, and this is going to be what? Well, this is going to be a Boolean, right? We're going to set it up to true. So we're initializing the loading as true. Now you could initialize it as false and do everything in reverse if you like, but I think setting up as true makes more sense intuitively for me. And okay, so now we've initialized our state for all of these contracts and balances, but we haven't actually written any of it out or brought them in per se. So let's get started in actually bringing in the contracts and hooking them up to the state. Okay, so the first thing that we could do here actually is we could update the state for our account before we do the contracts, because we never actually updated the state for our account. And how could we do this? Well, in our load blockchain data, right under our console.log here, or actually here, let's go above the console.log of the account. What we can actually do is set the state in here to update it in our account. Well, it's as simple as bringing in this .set state, and within here, we can actually just set the state. We can actually set the state. So we can actually say here, account should be account. And now we can actually choose which account. And we want it to be account 1, right? Account 1. We want it to be account 1, right? So let's save this and let's refresh. And we're saving. And we're not receiving anything. Oh, and that's because this array is only spitting out the first account, the account that we wanted specifically, right? So I just got confused. We want just this account. So it's not 1, right? We're not grabbing it from the second Ganesh. We're grabbing it from this array, which is the first one. So this should actually be 0. So let's save that. And there you go. I don't know if you saw that, but first it initializes the first account, and then boom, it updates the state and then sees what the account address is, and there it is. So we have now officially updated the account into the app, not just on the console. Awesome. So this is working. Setting the state is working. And again, if you were looking at this set state, if you were looking at the set state really confused and you don't understand what's going on, don't worry. We're going to do this a bunch, and each time it should make a little bit more sense than the last. Okay, so we can remove this console log for now. Save that. And now let's think about how do we bring in our contracts and initialize the state. And initialize the state for our contracts, Tether, Reward, and our decentral bank. Okay, so I've been having some video crashing difficulties, but we will get through this. I have to re-record this video for the 3rd time, I think now. Well, hopefully I'll make less mistakes that way. Anyway, you probably don't want to hear about that stuff. All right, so let's get back to the video at hand. So the task at hand, sorry. So what are we doing now? So the next step here for us is to actually bring in the Tether contract. We want to load in one of these contracts together. That's what we're going to be doing. And it really is a question of, well, okay, so we have the contracts, we built the smart contracts, we have the front end, so how do we load this in? We're loading in blockchain data already. Well, the first thing we need to do and we need to consider is actually that we are loading it from which network. Because remember, Ethereum has multiple networks. Ganache is one of the networks, and each network has their own specific network IDs, right? So the Ganache network ID is over here. We can see it's 5777. All right, so this is the network that we're using. This is the testing environment that we want to be using. The mainnet has its own, the Ropsten has its own, etc. So how do we get that network? Do we have that network even set up? Well, we should, right? Because we compiled everything in our Truffle config to our ABIs to that network. So to check this, if we go to our tether JSON, and if we find network, or we look up network, we're going to see that we have different networks. And we see 5777 right here. So the Ganache network is there. Okay, that's great. So, and remember that we are grabbing everything from our JSON. Our ABIs are in the JSON. Our addresses, our information, all our pertinent information is in this tether. So we want to bring in this JSON file essentially as well into our app. So let's do that actually first and foremost. So to do that, we want to scroll to the top. And we want to actually physically import tether. So we do that by saying import tether from, and to go out of our directory, because we want to back up out of our components and go into the Truffle APIs, we got to do // Truffle APIs /, and now we can go into that directory, tether.json. All right, so that's how we import tether. So now that we have tether imported, we're going to use that in a bit. Let's go back into our blockchain data and think about bringing in the network. How do we how do we set our network up to 5777? So what we can do here is we can create a new variable. And let's call this variable tether data. And let's set our tether data to the network. And how can we do that? Well, what we can do is we can say tether data equals tether.network. So what we want to do is we want to set up a network ID for us that we can then verify and that we can actually hook it up then to our tether contract. So how do we do that? Well, let's make a new variable and call it constant network ID. Okay. And we're going to grab it from Web3, right? So we're going to say web3.eth.net.getID, and we're going to call the getID, right? The method over here. And of course, this is we're going to have to wait for this to happen, right? This is asynchronous, so we're going to say await. And let's go ahead and see if this is working. How are we going to do that? Well, if you guessed by now, console log, then you're becoming a coding console log ninja. And what do we log? The network ID, right? So let's save this and see if we get a response. And actually, let's tag it. So we can say network ID, like that. Whatever. Okay, so let's go into our local host and let's refresh. And now if I scroll up, oh, there it is. Would you look at that? So Tharshi blows the network ID 5777, and that means that it's 77, and that means that it's loading up. So we've got our network ID, and that is the Ganache network ID. That's the correct ID that we need. We're on the right network. Okay, we're heading in the right direction. So we can remove this console log for now. And so now that we have the network ID, what is the next logical step? Well, the next logical step now is to actually bring in the contract, right? Let's load up the tether contract. So let's load tether contract, and I'll put some comments so we know that's what we're doing under here. So in order to load this tether contract, let's think about it together. What do we actually need to write? What do we need to bring in to make this happen? Well, there's two things, right? We want to load the tether contract, and then we want to set it to the state of tether. And then we also want to load the tether balance and set it to the state of the tether balance. Because right now these are initialized, but there's nothing in them. So we want to bring them in and then throw them into tether and bring them into tether balance. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, the first thing, let's consider the network ID. And let's think, hey, well, what we want to ensure is that the network ID is there, because we want to be hooking it up into this network ID. And if the network ID isn't there, we want to be able to notify people and say, hey, listen, there's no network ID, so we can't load these contracts, because if we can't get the network, then we can't get the contracts for the network. So hopefully that makes sense. If not, doesn't matter. If not, don't worry, we're going to write it out. So write it out. So what's the first thing we should do? Let's make a variable and call it constant tether data, okay? And the tether data is actually going to be the network ID, and we could grab it from tether. So we can say tether.networks, okay? Just like we were grabbing it from the network file. And then if we want the specific ID, we don't hard code. We never hard code. We grab it from the network ID, which we already have here. So now we can just reuse this network ID. Isn't that cool how you can do that when you're coding? Isn't that cool? No, because now everything is dynamic. So now our tether data is set up. And because we have our tether data, we can say if there is tether data, so if this is true, then let's execute the following in our blockchain data function, right? So what do we want to execute? Well, we're going to create another variable. We're going to create a new variable, and it's going to be just tether, right? Because what is this variable going to be essentially? Oh, let me close this network thing on top. Okay, so essentially tether, what it's going to be is it's going to be the contract, right? It's going to be the pertinent information of the contract. We're going to want the address, and we want the ABI information, and we're going to want it in JavaScript. So we want it from the JSON into this JavaScript that we can use. So in order to do that, we're going to leverage Web3. So we can say constant tether equals Web3, our best friend, and we want it from ETH, right? Because it's Ethereum, okay? And what do we want from ETH? Well, we want contract, right? Because we want the contract. And what information do we want specifically from the contract? Well, we want the ABI and the address. So to get the ABI, we can just grab it from tether. And for the address, though, we can actually get the address from the tether data, right? So we'll do tether data dot address like that. And just like that, we're actually sending our contract now into this new variable tether. So we've got our contract. So what should be the next step after we've got it in this variable? Well, it can't just sit here, right? It's got to go somewhere. So where's it going to go? It's going to go into the state, right? So we want this to be the state in here. So we can't just put tether in here. What we have to do is we have to use set state. So we're going to do this dot set state, just like we did above, right? You see over here, we're doing the same thing. And what are we setting the state this time to? Well, it's to the object of tether. That's it. We're setting the state to tether, and just like that, we've actually now set up our state. Okay, so we're halfway there. We're halfway there. So what do we need to do next? Well, we've got the state. Next up we need is the balance. So how do we get the balance? Well, we're going to make another variable called balance, right? But this time we're going to make balance a let variable instead of a constant. And we do this because our balance is going to change, right? Constant tether, the contract's not going to change, but our balance here is going to be changing. So we're going to do let tether balance like this. And what is tether balance going to equal? Well, it's going to be similar to grabbing the contract, but instead we want to grab the balance of, and we can go from and we can do this from tether now. And we can grab this now from our tether, right? So we can say tether, but if we're grabbing it through this Web3 now, if we're grabbing it through Web3, we have to use methods. So we have to say methods dot balance of, and then within here we can say balance of. What do we want to grab the balance of to be? Well, we want the balance to be of the account, right? Of the tether account. This account, we want this account. And we can try to put in the account and hard code it, but why do that when we have the state of the account? We've already created it. So how do we bring in the state of the account to the balance of? Well, it's as simple as writing this dot state dot account, and we bring it in that way. And finally, because we're using methods, we have to remember to run the call function. So this is because it's a callback, and you have to remember this only because we are running it through Web3. We didn't have to run these calls, if you remembered, when we were doing the Truffle console balance of testing, because we weren't running it this way. We weren't going through the methods. But because we're shooting it through methods, we have to do the callback. If you want to know more about it, it's not really so important. But it's not really so important to what we're doing right now. But if you're curious about it, go ahead, check the documentation in Web3, and you can find out more about how the callback works and why we have to call it this way. But that's it, really. After this, now we actually have our tether balance. So what do we do once we have our tether? What do we do once we have our tether balance? Well, what did we do once we had our tether? We set the state. So what do we do with our tether balance? Same dealio, right? So this dot set state, and it's going to be a little bit different though, because remember the tether balance is a string, whereas this is an object. So we want this as a string. So how do we do that? Well, we set balance, and we set the balance like this. Sorry, we'll say tether balance, and we're going to set it to tether balance to string, right? Just like how we were doing it before in Truffle. And that's it. That's the code. Okay, so that's how we load in the tether contract. So yeah, it's a little bit, it can be very confusing if you've never actually coded before. But hopefully it's not so bad. Hopefully you're following some of this, if not all of it. And then finally, what we want to do is write our error message, right? So we want to say else, if we don't load tether data, if the network isn't present, let's just run a window.alert and say error tether contract not deployed to the network. Deployed to detect network. To not deployed, no detected network. Something like that, okay? And this is sort of like our try-catch error, and it's just a way of making this function more robust, because we have to always be thinking when we're writing functions, well, what happens if it doesn't work? What happens if somebody does this or that? And we're not going to go into try-catch errors in this course per se, but I still want to implement best practices. So just so you get into the mind frame of thinking like that and writing your code out in that way, it's very important. It's very important to write code that is robust. And ultimately, yeah, that's it. So let's go ahead and, what we're going to do? Let's console log the balance to see that this is working. So let's run a console.log. And how do we do that? Well, we're just going to say console.log balance of tether balance over here. Okay. So we're going to grab the balance. And let's save and see if the balance pops up and if we did this correctly. So let's go back to our Firefox. And we're getting tether data not defined. Okay, so we have an error, so let's check it out. Tether data should be capitalized, right? My bad. So that's camel case. Let's save, let's go back. Okay, and it says error, please use the new keyword to instantiate. Okay, so this needs to be new, right? We're creating a new object over here. So let's save that. Let's go back. Okay, so now we see another error, tether.methods.balance of. All right, so I know what happened over here. Can you guess what I did wrong? Good old await, right? We have to wait for this to come through. Again, this is asynchronous, so let's save that. And let's try again. Welcome to the world of coding. And okay, error. So let's make sure the MetaMask is connected. I think it disconnected for some reason. Okay, we're reconnected. Let's load this again. Okay, awesome. All right, so I fixed my errors, I loaded up MetaMask, and now we see we actually get a balance, and that balance is 1 million. And you could be thinking, whoa, 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 hold, and you could be saying, whoa, 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 hold on, Clarian, that's not 1 million. What happened? I thought we did all the formatting. I'm like, well, and I'll tell you, well, don't worry, we have to recreate those function helpers now for JavaScript, and we're going to do that. That's going to convert this for us and format it. But this is 1 million, right? That's what we know. We've been through this a bunch. We know that this is 1 million. It's bringing in the information. That's the most important thing. We are getting the balance of the Tether token. We did it. Amazing. So let's just go through what we did exactly, and hopefully this will help clarify. So the first thing we did is we get the network ID, okay? So we set the network ID to this variable network ID, and then we set the network ID to the Tether network, and then we set the Tether network with the network ID to this variable called Tether data. Now we say that if Tether data is true, okay, so if Tether data is there and it's present, if JavaScript finds it, if our application finds the Tether data loading, then we actually create this variable called Tether. And within Tether, we set up the contract. We set up a contract that's readable, taking the address and the ABI from Tether. And then we take that information and set it into the state, into the object. We turn it into this new object that becomes the contract, and it becomes accessible through our state. It's dynamic. The contract is now in our state. So when the contract changes, the state gets updated and we get the new information. So that if any transactions happen or whatever goes on, the state updates and the state updates with the contract. Excellent. After we do that, we create another variable called tether balance. Now the balance is changing, right? So this variable, we grab it, this variable, we set it, to the, we set it up to our tether, we set it up to our constant variable tether. So we're grabbing it from the Web3, this new Web3. And when we're going through Web3, we have to use methods to get the balance, right? Because we want to get the balance. We get the balance from the account, which is already passed into state. So we pass it again through state by calling this .state.account. And then all this has to be a callback because that's how methods work in Web3. So we have to run this call, .call. That's why the .call is there at the end. After we do that, tether balance is good to go with the balance. We just need to convert it to a string and set it to the state. And that's what we do over here. And finally, if there is no tether data, if it doesn't load for whatever reason, we want to set up this window alert message, error, tether contract not deployed, no detected network. And actually, we can see this window alert message. If I go back here, if I were to switch networks, right now we're in the Ganache network, but what if I switch to the Ropsten network and we refresh? Boom. Refresh. And there you go. So now we get this message, error, exclamation mark, tether contract not deployed, no detected network. That's our error message. It's coming in nice and strong. So if we switch back again to Ganache and we refresh, everything's loading. And we're no longer getting the balance because I removed the console log. Okay, so everything's working. So hopefully going through that again with you step by step has provided some more clarity for you. If not, don't worry about it. It will take a little bit of time to wrap your head around it. But in any case, when you're ready to move forward, I've got an exercise for you. Your next exercise, now that we've loaded together the Tether contract and we've gone through it all step by step, your exercise is to load in the reward contract. So we want the reward tokens and we want the decentral bank. We also want the reward contract to update the tether balance. Sorry, not the tether balance. We want to update the reward balance. And I'll give you a hint for the decentral bank. We want to not only update the state of the decentral bank by bringing in the contract, but we also want to update the staking balance. So you got to figure out how to do that. All right, so that's your exercise. And if you can just do the first one, just the reward token, that's great. If you can do both, that's incredible. If you can't do either and you're confused by all this and it's not making much sense, don't worry. In the next video, we're going to go through the solution together and we're just going to code it out as we've been doing so far. So keep up the awesome work. So keep up the great work. Keep up the great work. And I'll see you in the next video with the solution. Okay, bye-bye. All right, so hopefully you had some success with bringing in our reward contract and bringing in the central bank and loading both those contracts up. If you got just the reward contract, congratulations, that's great. If you got both, that's amazing, because it would be just a little bit more tricky because we're bringing in the staking balance, right? We don't want the central bank balance. We want the staking balance specifically. So if you didn't figure out how to do any of it, don't worry at all. We're going to go through it together now and figure this out. So it's going to be quite similar pretty much to how we loaded the Tether contract, right? So the first thing we want to do is go up to the top, and we're going to want to import these other contracts. So to do that, we're going to go up over here, and then we're going to import and import. And we're going to change these imports. So we want RWD from RWD, and these are JSON, so let's make sure, yeah. And then we want the decentral bank one, so decentral bank. Okay, perfect. So now we are importing them into our React. And next up over here, what we want to do is that we want to load these contracts. So I'm just going to take this code and copy and paste it, and then make some modifications. Because it's going to be quite similar for both of them. So for the reward contract, what we're going to do is we're just going to rename it reward or RWD. And here we're going to change the variable. So we're going to say RWD data. We want it from RWD, right? This is going to be RWD data, RWD data. This is going to be RWD. This is going to be RWD. This is going to be RWD. This will be RWD balance. Ugh. So hopefully you see what I'm doing here. It's basically the same thing that we had before, except for now we're actually switching it for rewards instead of for Tether, right? And rwd.abi, rwd.data, okay, and we want the balance of, so we just grab it from balance of again, right? Same thing. Okay, so that should be good for the RWD balance. And then for the Tether contract, it's going to be slightly different. Oh, here, let me actually fix the indenting. All right. I don't know why this is going like that. Let's fix that. Let's just move this up. Sure. Okay, that's fine. Actually, here, let's make them look the same. Let's do that. Okay, so for the Tether contract, we're going to do the same thing, only for Tether. So we're going to do Tether data. Oops, sorry, this isn't Tether data. This is the decentral bank contract. So decentral bank, we're going to grab it from the decentral bank, right? This is going to be decentral bank here. Oh, sorry, this is going to be decentral bank data. It's basically the same thing. We're just switching it up, so I'm going through it pretty quickly. Central bank, decentral bank data. Okay, we grab the ABI from decentral bank. We grab the ABI from the central bank, and we want the data from the address that we set up over here, right? And then we can set this up to the central bank. And we're going to let the central... Oh, sorry. This is going to be our staking balance, right? Because it comes from our bank. So we're going to let staking balance equal Tether methods. And instead of grabbing the balance of, what can we grab? Well, we can actually grab the staking balance, actually. And that would be the difference right there. And here it's the staking balance. And staking balance, we want to turn that to string. And we want the staking balance. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this. And, oh, also for the alerts, let's fix this. Reward token not deployed, and decentral bank not deployed to the network. Okay, so let's save this. And okay, so we have an error, line 62, tether is not defined. Oops. So this should be decentral bank. Let's go back. Okay, and awesome. All right, so looks like things are working. And yeah, there's no balance yet, so that's fine. That's fine that we're seeing this at 0. So let's go ahead and remove these console logs. Okay. And the final thing that we want to do here is actually the loading, right? So what do we want to say exactly, or how do we want to update the state when we load the blockchain data? Well, after we've loaded all these contracts, we want to switch our loading because it means that everything has been loaded. We loaded this, we loaded that contract, we loaded all 3 of our contracts, our staking balance. So what should the status of our loading change to? Well, it's true right now, and therefore it's no longer loading, so it should be false, right? And how do we do that? Well, we can just change the state. So we can say this.state, and loading, we can switch to false. Actually, sorry, we're setting the state, right? It's not grabbing the state, we're setting the state. So this.setState, loading to false. All right, so let's check to see that there's no error here. Let's refresh. Looks like everything's working. And let's actually just check the loading. So what we can do is we can go down into our render and we can just go anywhere. Like we can go in our H1 over here and let's bring in some JavaScript, and we can do this by saying this.state.loading. Okay, and we can actually console.log it. So why don't we do console.log this.state.loading. Let's refresh. Okay, and let's see what happened here. So if you scroll up, we're going to see that we have all these trues, and then we have a false. So what exactly happened? It was true, 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 then false. So why did that happen? Did it happen? Why did it happen? Does it mean that it's broken and it's crazy? No, actually what happened was that when I refresh, we're actually seeing JavaScript loading everything that we want, all the data in the order we want it to be loading. So what that means is that all of these things in action were loading first. First the Tether contract, the reward contract, the central bank contract, and then the loading. And that's why we set it to false. If we were to set this to true and we were to reload, it would go true, 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 true. It would always be true, right? Okay, so just hopefully that just helps to illustrate for you how loading mechanism is actually working and how we can see things rendering on the page one thing at a time. If that doesn't make any sense, don't worry about it. Don't worry. It does take a little bit of time to wrap your head around that when it comes to working with mounting. When it comes to working with loading data, it takes a little bit of time, but you will get the hang of it. Okay, so let's just stop there for now. We've successfully loaded in all of our contracts and the loading value. This is excellent work up to this point. In the next videos, what we're going to do is just finish up the project here. So what that really means is we are going to bring in the rest of the functionality and get these contracts to load up so we can see what the balances are and we can make these deposits and these withdrawals and then make it look a little bit and then pretty it up a little bit when we're done. Okay, so great job. I'll see you. Great job. Great job. Yes, this code over here could be a little bit daunting. Don't worry. Take it slow. Take your time. Go through it. I promise it'll all make sense in time. All right. See you in the next video.